The first person who told me I wasn't allowed to see my own baby wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a nurse. It wasn't even hospital security. It was my mother-in-law. Less than 12 hours after I gave birth to my daughter, I slowly walked down the maternity hallway wearing hospital socks, exhausted, sore, and still trying to process becoming a mother. Before I could reach my room, my mother-in-law stepped in front of me with her arms folded and calmly said, "The baby is sleeping. You shouldn't disturb her right now." For a second, I genuinely thought the medication was making me hear things. I looked past her toward my room. The door was closed. Two visitors I didn't recognize were standing inside the hallway wearing guest badges. My own name was nowhere on the visitor board outside the room. Then my mother-in-law smiled as though everything happening was perfectly reasonable. "We're keeping things quiet," she explained. "The real family is spending time with the baby first." Before I tell you what happened next, let me say something to every new parent listening. Childbirth teaches you very quickly that exhaustion makes people vulnerable. You're physically drained, emotionally overwhelmed, and forced to trust complete strangers with the most important person in your life. Most of those strangers deserve that trust. Unfortunately, sometimes the people who abuse your vulnerability aren't strangers at all. They're relatives who mistake access for authority. If stories about family boundaries, emotional justice, and ordinary people standing up for themselves are why you're here, then stay with me. Because my mother-in-law believed hospital rules could be rewritten simply because she wanted to become the center of my daughter's first day. She was about to discover that hospitals take identity much more seriously than family opinions. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I was 32 years old when my daughter Emma entered the world, after 19 exhausting hours of labor that ended in an emergency cesarean section. Nothing about the birth went according to plan, but the moment I heard my daughter's first cry, every disappointment seemed insignificant compared with the relief of knowing she was healthy. My husband, Daniel, never left my side through the entire procedure. Sterile harder than I did when the nurses placed Emma against my shoulder for those first precious minutes before taking her to the recovery nursery while I was moved back to my room. Looking back now, I still believe those first moments should have been the memory that defined our daughter's birthday. Instead, someone else decided the day should revolve around herself. My relationship with Daniel's mother, Patricia Collins, had always been polite rather than close. She wasn't openly cruel, and she rarely shouted or created dramatic scenes. Her approach was much quieter. Patricia believed every important family decision naturally belonged to her. When Daniel and I bought our first house, she criticized where we placed furniture because older people understand homes better. When we announced the pregnancy, she immediately started referring to the baby as our little girl instead of your daughter. During my baby shower, she quietly replaced several gifts from my side of the family with decorations she personally preferred because she thought the photographs would look more elegant. None of those moments seemed serious enough to justify a confrontation by themselves. Together, however, they painted a picture I should have recognized much sooner. Patricia didn't simply enjoy helping. She struggled to accept situations where she wasn't in control. The hospital had very clear maternity policies. Every mother received an identification bracelet matching the newborn's bracelet immediately after delivery. Visitors required authorization from the patient, and any changes to visitor access had to be approved by the mother, unless medical circumstances prevented her from making decisions. During admission, the nurse carefully reviewed every form with me while Daniel listened beside the bed. We listed each other as primary contacts, declined extended family access to medical information, and specifically requested that no visitors be admitted without our permission because we wanted 24 quiet hours alone with our daughter before introducing relatives. Patricia looked disappointed when Daniel explained the plan several weeks before delivery, but she smiled politely and said she understood. At the time, I believed her. The emergency cesarean changed everything. After surgery, I remained in recovery longer than expected because my blood pressure dropped unexpectedly. Daniel accompanied Emma to the nursery for routine newborn examinations while nurses monitored me. About an hour later, one of the obstetricians asked Daniel to meet briefly with our insurance coordinator regarding medication approvals that couldn't wait until discharge. He hesitated because he didn't want to leave me alone, but I encouraged him to go. "I'll be asleep before you get back," I joked weakly. He kissed my forehead, promised he'd return within 20 minutes, and left believing both his wife and daughter were exactly where they were supposed to be. Neither of us knew Patricia had arrived at the hospital 15 minutes earlier. When I finally woke several hours later, the recovery nurse helped me sit up and encouraged me to walk slowly toward my maternity room for the first time. Every step felt like climbing a mountain, but all I could think about was holding Emma again. The nurse smiled as we reached the hallway. "Your husband should already be with the baby," she said. I smiled back. He's probably counting her fingers for the 10th time. We rounded the corner toward room 418, and that's when everything stopped making sense. Patricia was standing directly outside my room, wearing a visitor badge that identified her as primary family contact. Behind her, I could hear people laughing softly inside my room. She immediately stepped into my path before I reached the door. "Oh, good," she said pleasantly. "You're awake." I looked at the badge around her neck. So, then at the visitor board, down, then back at her. "Why does your badge say primary family contact?" She answered so casually it almost sounded rehearsed. "No, because someone needed to organize things while you were recovering." I left. I stared at her. "What does that mean?" She smiled. "It means I updated the visitor list." Then she placed one hand on the doorknob. "Oh, and right now," she lowered her voice, the baby doesn't need any more excitement." I honestly thought Patricia was trying to make a joke. My body still ached from surgery. I was exhausted, and nothing about the situation seemed real enough to process. "Patricia," I said carefully, "please move." She smiled with the kind of patient expression adults use when calming an emotional child. "Lauren, you've had major surgery. The nurses said you need to rest." I glanced toward the room again. I could hear my daughter's tiny cry, followed by unfamiliar voices trying to soothe her. Every instinct inside me screamed to open that door, yet my mother-in-law remained standing directly in front of it, as though she had every right to decide who entered. "My baby is in there," I said quietly. Patricia nodded. "Exactly, which is why we're keeping things peaceful until you're stronger." Those words finally broke through the fog of medication. She wasn't misunderstanding the situation. She genuinely believed she had the authority to manage access to my own child. The recovery nurse beside me frowned immediately. "Mrs. Collins," she said politely, "Lauren is the patient assigned to this room." Patricia gave a practiced smile. Of course she is. I'm simply helping because she's recovering from anesthesia. The nurse looked at the visitor badge around Patricia's neck. Who changed your visitor status? Patricia answered without hesitation. The front desk updated everything after speaking with the family. Something about that response immediately caught the nurse's attention. Hospital staff almost never referred vaguely to the family. They identified the patient by name. Excuse me, one moment, the nurse said before stepping toward the nurse's station a few doors away. Patricia watched her leave, then turned back toward me. Lauren, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Daniel asked me to help while he handled paperwork. I knew my husband well enough to recognize the half-truth immediately. Daniel might have asked her to wait nearby. He would never ask anyone to stand between me and our daughter. As we stood there, the maternity room door opened from the inside. Daniel's cousin Melissa stepped into the hallway carrying a pink gift bag and nearly walked into us. She looked startled to see me standing outside. "Lauren," she said, "we thought you were still asleep." I forced a smile. Apparently not. Before she could say anything else, I looked past her shoulder into the room. Patricia's two sisters were sitting near the window taking photographs, while Daniel's uncle gently rocked my daughter in the hospital bassinet. My own mother wasn't there. Neither was my father. None of the people Daniel and I had agreed would meet Emma later that evening had even been called. Somehow, Patricia had filled the room with her side of the family, while I, the mother, stood outside wearing a hospital bracelet and trying to understand why I wasn't inside. The nurse returned only moments later, accompanied by charge nurse Angela Morris, a woman whose calm expression suggested she had spent years resolving situations exactly like this. She greeted me first. "Mrs. Mitchell, how are you feeling?" "Confused," I answered honestly. Angela nodded once before looking at Patricia. "Mrs. Collins, may I ask who authorized the visitor list changes this afternoon?" Patricia remained surprisingly confident. "Lauren was recovering, so I handled things temporarily." Angela didn't react. "Did Lauren authorize you to do that?" Patricia hesitated for the first time. "Well, someone had to make decisions." Angela's expression didn't change. "Only the patient or her designated representative may change maternity visitor access." Patricia folded her arms. "Her husband agreed I should help." Angela turned toward me. "Photographers? Did you appoint Mrs. Collins as your representative?" "No," I answered immediately. "Never." Angela thanked me politely before removing a small tablet from her uniform pocket and opening Lauren Mitchell's electronic patient record. She reviewed the file quietly for several seconds, scrolling through admission notes Daniel and I had completed together the previous evening. Finally, she looked up. "According to the chart," she said calmly, "Lauren Mitchell requested restricted visitation. Primary contacts are Lauren Mitchell and Daniel Mitchell only." Patricia stepped forward. "There must be a mistake." And Bella Angela turned the screen slightly so Patricia could see it without revealing private medical information. "There isn't." Patricia frowned. "Then why was I given this badge?" Angela studied the visitor badge clipped to Patricia's sweater. The color immediately caught her attention. It wasn't the standard temporary visitor badge issued by maternity. It was a manually printed administrative badge, normally used only after specific approval requests. Angela looked back toward the nurse's station. "Who printed this credential?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Then she tapped something on the tablet. "I'd like to know exactly when this visitor record was modified." While Angela reviewed the electronic logs, Daniel hurried down the hallway carrying a folder of insurance paperwork. The moment he saw me standing outside the room, his smile disappeared. Lauren. He crossed the hallway in seconds. Why are you out here? Before I could answer, Patricia immediately stepped toward him. Everything's under control. Daniel looked from his mother to me, then to the charge nurse holding the electronic chart. Mom, he said slowly, what's going on? Patricia sighed dramatically. Lauren needs rest. I was simply helping everyone meet the baby while she recovered. Daniel stared at her for a moment before asking the question that changed the entire conversation. Why would Lauren need permission to see her own daughter? Patricia opened her mouth. But Angela spoke first. No. Mr. Staff, Mitchell. She turned the tablet toward him. Someone accessed your wife's patient record 38 minutes ago. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Angela's expression became noticeably more serious. It means someone changed the maternity visitor permissions. Lasting, she looked directly at Patricia. And I don't believe they had the authority to do it. Daniel looked from the tablet in Angela's hands to the visitor badge hanging around his mother's neck. Mom, he said quietly, did you ask someone to change Lauren's hospital records? Patricia shook her head immediately. Don't exaggerate. I only explained that Lauren was recovering and someone needed to coordinate visitors. Angela remained perfectly calm. Mrs. Collins, hospital visitor permissions aren't adjusted through conversations in the hallway. Every change creates an electronic record showing who requested it, who approved it, and which employee account processed the request. Patricia's confidence faded just slightly. Then there must be some misunderstanding. Angela gave a polite nod. That's exactly what we're trying to determine. She asked another nurse to escort me into my room while she continued reviewing the access logs. The moment I stepped through the doorway, every conversation stopped. Patricia's sisters immediately stood up from their chairs. Daniel's uncle carefully placed Emma's bassinet back beside the hospital bed. My daughter opened her eyes just as I reached her, and every frustration of the previous 20 minutes disappeared the instant I lifted her into my arms. She was warm, impossibly small, and completely unaware that adults had turned her first day into a family power struggle. I kissed her forehead gently and whispered the only thing that mattered. Hi, sweetheart. Mommy's here. Nothing else in the room mattered after that. Daniel quietly asked his relatives to give us a few minutes alone. No one argued. His aunt apologized softly as she left, clearly uncomfortable after realizing they had been invited under circumstances they hadn't fully understood. Within moments, the room emptied except for Daniel, Emma, and me. He sat beside the bed looking genuinely shaken. Lauren, he said, I swear I never gave Mom permission to change anything. I believed him. I know. He rubbed both hands across his face. I asked her to wait in the lobby while I met with the insurance coordinator. That's it. We sat together in silence, watching Emma sleep for several moments before he spoke again. How long were you standing outside? Long enough to be told I shouldn't disturb my own baby. His eyes closed briefly. I'm so sorry. A gentle knock interrupted us. Angela entered, accompanied by a woman wearing a navy blazer instead of nursing scrubs. Her identification badge read, Rebecca Lawson, Hospital Administrator. She introduced herself warmly before taking a seat near the window. Mrs. Mitchell, she said, first, I want to apologize for the experience you've had this afternoon. Our priority is making sure you and your daughter are safe and that your wishes are respected. I thanked her, though I still wasn't entirely sure what had happened. Rebecca folded her hands calmly. We've reviewed the initial electronic records. Someone requested an administrative override on your visitor restrictions while you were in recovery. Daniel frowned. Who approved it? Rebecca answered carefully. That's what we're investigating. At this point, we know the request didn't come from either parent. Angela handed Rebecca a printed activity log. The timeline was surprisingly detailed. At 1:14 p.m., my patient file had been opened from the front desk terminal. At 1:18 p.m., visitor permissions changed from restricted to family approved. At 1:21 p.m., Patricia Collins was issued an administrative family contact badge. At 1:27 p.m., 6 additional visitor badges were printed under that authorization. Rebecca looked up from the report. Mrs. Mitchell, did you authorize any of these changes while you were in recovery? No. Mr. Mitchell, Daniel answered just as firmly. No. Rebecca nodded once before making another note. Then, these changes violated hospital policy. Just then, another employee knocked on the open door. It was Melissa Grant, the admissions supervisor responsible for the maternity front desk. She looked deeply uncomfortable before addressing Rebecca directly. I think I know what happened. Rebecca invited her inside. Melissa explained that Patricia had approached the admissions desk shortly after arriving at the hospital and introduced herself as the baby's primary grandmother. According to Melissa, Patricia repeatedly emphasized that both parents were unavailable because Lauren remained under anesthesia and Daniel had been called away for insurance paperwork. She told us she was coordinating visitors until the parents returned, Melissa admitted. When I said visitor restrictions required patient approval, she showed me a handwritten note with Daniel's name at the bottom. Daniel looked genuinely confused. A handwritten note? Melissa nodded. It said, "Please let my mother coordinate family visits while we're busy with recovery. Thank you, Daniel Mitchell." Daniel stared at her. No, man, I never wrote that. Melissa swallowed nervously. There, I realize that now. I realize. Rebecca asked the obvious question. No. Do you still have the note? Melissa nodded. Oh, I kept it because administrative overrides require documentation. No. She handed a small folded piece of paper to Rebecca. Daniel looked at it once. Away, then immediately shook his head. Maybe. That's not my handwriting. That's. Angela compared Daniel's signature from his admission paperwork with the signature on the note. They weren't even close. Rebecca slowly placed the note back on the table. No one is making accusations, she said carefully. But someone presented hospital staff with a document that appears to misrepresent parental authorization. The room fell completely silent. Then Angela's work phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. That looked toward Rebecca, Hannah, and quietly said, "Security just reviewed the hallway cameras." Rebecca looked up. So, what did they find? Angela took a slow breath. They found exactly who handed that note to admissions. Angela's words settled over the room with an almost physical weight. Daniel instinctively stood beside my bed while I held Emma a little closer. Rebecca Lawson remained composed, but I noticed the subtle change in her posture. The conversation had shifted from misunderstanding to investigation. "What did the camera show?" she asked. Angela looked down at the report in her hand before answering. At 1:11 p. Me, Mrs. Collins approached the admissions desk. She turned one page. So, at 1:13 p.m., she handed a folded note to the admissions supervisor. Another page. Salams. At 1:16 p.m., after the visitor badge was printed, she called 6 members of her family from the lobby. Nobody spoke. Done. Because there wasn't much left to interpret. The timeline matched the electronic record almost perfectly. Rebecca folded her hands together. It's okay, Mrs. Mitchell, she said gently. Before we continue, I need to ask you something required under hospital policy. No, of course. Do you wish to keep your current restricted visitor status? I didn't hesitate. But, yes. But, Rebecca nodded. Then effective immediately. No visitor will enter this maternity room without your direct authorization. She turned toward Angela. Done. Please deactivate every administrative visitor badge issued this afternoon. Angela entered 2 commands into her tablet. A moment later, her device chimed softly. Jammy hot. All temporary badges have been revoked. Daniel looked relieved. Oh, I thought the situation was finally over. It wasn't. Less than 5 minutes later, raised voices echoed from the hallway. Patricia open. Even before I heard the words clearly, I recognized her tone. This is ridiculous. The maternity unit suddenly became very quiet. Then another voice answered. This, professional. Hunter, calm. Vase, hospital security. Do, Mrs. Nom Collins. Your visitor credential is no longer active. You can't do that. Me. We already have. And though Daniel sighed heavily. I'll talk to her. But Rebecca gently raised one hand. No. Patas. He looked confused. So, she is your mother. Rebecca nodded. Mutton. And she's currently the subject of an administrative review. She stood. He left. Hospital policy requires staff to handle this. Daniel slowly sat back down. What? For the first time since arriving, I realized Rebecca wasn't protecting hospital procedures. She was protecting us. Outside the room, Patricia's voice became louder. I've done nothing wrong. You're embarrassing this family. You people have no idea how hospitals work. Angela quietly stepped into the hallway. Do that. Through the partially open door, I could see Patricia gesturing toward our room while several visitors watched from farther down the corridor. Angela never raised her voice. So, she simply spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Here? Mrs. Markellans. Patricia stopped talking. Daff. Your visitor authorization has been revoked. Patricia laughed. You can't revoke my grandson's grandmother. So. Angela remained perfectly calm. No. Fine. We revoked your badge. They're different things. For the first time all afternoon. Patricia had no immediate answer. Rebecca joined them a few seconds later. Mrs. Collins. Patricia turned, tucked in from the bus. I've already explained everything. Oh no. Rebecca nodded politely. You explained your version. So she held up the folded handwritten note inside a clear evidence sleeve. See, men, now we'd like to discuss this first time. Patricia's face changed instantly. So, only for a second. Today, but it was enough. Today, you found that. Rebecca looked at her carefully. And then, yes, my wide. You told admissions Daniel wrote it. Patricia crossed her arms. So, he wanted me to help. Curse. Rebecca asked one simple question. So, did Daniel write this note? Silence. Somewhat no. Patricia looked toward the room where Daniel was now standing beside me. Oh, he met her eyes. No. Mom. Oh, his voice was quiet. Answer her. I am. Another long silence. Day. Finally, Patricia spoke. Wow. I mere 180. Batters wrote it. Nobody moved. Yes, nobody interrupted. Dup, dup. Rebecca waited. Just. Patricia tried again. Glather. I only wrote what Daniel would have wanted. Daniel slowly shook his head. Men. No. Very well. You wrote what you wanted. Very prim. Those 7 words seemed to drain every remaining argument from the hallway. Rebecca thanked Patricia for her honesty. Then she addressed security. I am Care. Please escort Mrs. Gemma Collins to the administrative conference room. Patricia frowned. Deaf. Am I being arrested? No. You're being interviewed. And for how long? Rebecca answered honestly. That depends on how many hospital policies were violated. Patricia looked around the hallway, searching for someone to defend her. Her sisters looked away. John, her brother, quietly studied the floor. Even Melissa, the admissions supervisor who had unknowingly processed the badge request, stood silently behind Rebecca. Patricia finally looked back at Daniel. You're just going to let this happen? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back into the room. Sat beside me. Hotev. Wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders. Kamina looked at our sleeping daughter, then said the sentence I had needed to hear since labor began. My responsibility is my wife. I pruded what he glanced toward Emma. And my daughter. My fuck. Only then did he look back toward the hallway. My responsibility isn't protecting bad decisions. Please. Security quietly guided Patricia away without another argument. The hallway slowly returned to normal. Son of. Rebecca remained standing for another moment before turning back toward us. I believe we've resolved the visitor issue. I smiled weakly. Duh, thank you. Chera. She smiled back. Amanach. I wish that were the only issue. Daniel frowned. Saku. What do you mean? Rebecca looked down at the electronic patient file still open on her tablet. The visitor list wasn't the only thing modified. The room became silent again. She slowly turned the screen toward us. 2. Someone also changed. She paused. Mother. Your baby's emergency medical contact information. Rebecca's words hung in the air long after she stopped speaking. Daniel looked at the tablet. Love, then back at Rebecca. Now, what do you mean someone changed Emma's emergency contact information? Rebecca turned the screen so both of us could see it. Bia, when you completed your admission paperwork yesterday, you listed 2 emergency decision makers. She pointed to the original record. Grading. Lauren Mitchell. Lauren, Daniel Mitchell. They, me. Then she opened the modification history. And my. At 1:19 p.m., approximately 5 minutes after the visitor permissions were changed, the secondary emergency contact was replaced. Daniel frowned. With who? Rebecca tapped the screen once. Since him. The updated record appeared. And that's Patricia Collins, Gemrid's Faluri. For a second, nobody in the room spoke. I stared at the screen. trying to understand how something so personal could have changed without either parent knowing. But Daniel finally found his voice. Yes, that isn't possible. Do. Rebecca nodded slowly. Do. It shouldn't have been. But Angela stepped beside her. Our maternity system normally requires verification from either parent before emergency contacts can be modified. Then, so how did it happen? Rebecca answered honestly. That's exactly what we're investigating. Data. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. So, this wasn't about visitors. Rebecca looked at him carefully. No. It appears someone attempted to establish decision-making authority. Those words landed harder than anything Patricia had done so far. Because visitor access lasted a few hours, emergency contacts mattered if something went wrong. If Emma needed urgent treatment while one of us was unavailable, hospital staff could potentially call Patricia first. So, Daniel looked physically sick. My mother would never actually try to make medical decisions. Rebecca didn't challenge him. My Reston, I hope you're right. Then she quietly added, our responsibility is making sure she never has the opportunity. Angela immediately restored the original emergency contact list. While Daniel and I watched, Cindy Semda, within seconds, both of our names reappeared exactly as we had entered them during admission. June. Rebecca printed the audit log and placed it into a sealed administrative folder. This document becomes part of the internal review. I looked at her. Now, what happens now? She folded the folder closed. Doctor, we determine whether this resulted from misunderstanding. She paused. Or intentional misrepresentation. Daniel suddenly remembered something. The bracelet. Everyone looked toward him. Okay. When Emma was born, every nurse kept checking our identification bracelets. Angela smiled faintly. Correct. No baby leaves the maternity unit without matching parent identification. So, Daniel nodded. So, even if someone changed paperwork, Angela finished the sentence, they still couldn't remove your daughter from the unit. Relief finally settled across my shoulders. But for the first time all afternoon, I realized the hospital had multiple layers of protection. Patricia had managed to confuse people. She hadn't managed to bypass the system. Oh, right. Just then, another soft knock came at the door. A pediatrician entered carrying Emma's morning chart. Emotionally, he introduced himself, completed a routine newborn examination, and smiled warmly after listening to her heartbeat. She looks wonderful, he said. So, as he prepared to leave, Rebecca quietly stopped him. One moment. Dr. Bames. She briefly explained that Emma's electronic chart had experienced unauthorized administrative modifications. The pediatrician's expression immediately became more serious. Okay, then I want an additional verification note placed in the record. So that Angela nodded. I've already started one. So, the doctor added his own electronic note before leaving. Rebecca looked toward us. From this point forward, she smiled reassuringly. Every staff member opening Emma's chart will immediately see an administrative alert requiring direct parental verification before accepting any non-medical request. Daniel let out a slow breath. So no one can change anything again. Rebecca answered carefully. No one can change anything without both of you knowing. That single sentence finally made me feel safe. About 20 minutes later, there was another gentle knock. This time it wasn't security. It was Melissa, the admissions supervisor. Melissa, she looked visibly embarrassed. Hey, Mrs. Genser, Mitchell. She took a deep breath. Good. I owe you an apology. I smiled gently. Otis, you weren't trying to hurt anyone. Originated for better. She shook her head. So mad. No, but I still should have followed policy. She explained exactly what had happened. Patricia had arrived speaking confidently, carrying flowers, photographs, and the handwritten note supposedly signed by Daniel. She knew both of our birthdays. She knew Emma's full name. Fathic. She even knew the room number before asking for directions. Nothing about her behavior suggested deception. She acted exactly like someone who had been coordinating everything with the parents. Melissa looked down. The twins. I trusted familiarity instead of verification. Rebecca gently placed one hand on Melissa's shoulder. And that's why hospitals investigate mistakes. The 2021, she looked at Daniel and me. That's why them. Not to punish honest employees. I found to improve systems. I appreciated that answer. Unnatly, because throughout the day, every member of the staff who made a mistake had also worked immediately to correct it. Nobody defended poor decisions. Oddly interesting. Nobody blamed us. They simply focused on protecting patients. That difference mattered. Late that afternoon, Rebecca returned one final time before ending her shift. She handed Daniel and me a printed summary of every correction already completed. Visitor permissions restored. Day 20. Emergency contacts corrected. MUN. Administrative badges revoked. New tone. Security alert activated. No. Additional parental verification added. Electronic audit preserved. Gem. She smiled warmly. Dade. I believe your daughter can finally enjoy the quiet first day you originally planned. Daniel laughed softly. I think we all can. Today, Rebecca started toward the door before stopping. There is one last thing. So, Daniel looked up. Daniel looked. Yes. The investigation uncovered another document. She hesitated. Duh. It wasn't submitted successfully, but someone tried. So no, I felt my stomach tighten again. Duck. What document? Rebecca opened the folder. Demps. Pulled out a partially completed authorization form. Then quietly slid it across my hospital bed. At the top, in Patricia's handwriting, someone had begun filling out paperwork requesting 17. Grandparent discharge authorization. One said for it. I stared at the partially completed discharge authorization form for several seconds before I realized what I was actually looking at. The hospital logo appeared across the top. Emma's name had already been entered. The room number was correct. My delivery date was correct. Under the section labeled Authorized Adult for Newborn Discharge, Patricia had begun writing her own name before the form was abandoned. The signature lines remained blank, but that hardly mattered. Daniel picked up the document with trembling hands. She was trying to take Emma home. Rebecca immediately shook her head. No, this form alone couldn't accomplish that. She spoke carefully, choosing every word. Hospital policy requires matching parent identification bracelets, physician discharge approval, and signatures from the legal parents before a newborn leaves the maternity unit. This document had absolutely no legal effect. She paused. What concerns us is why someone believed they should begin filling it out. Daniel slowly lowered the paper onto the bed. I don't understand. he whispered. Neither do I, Rebecca admitted, which is why we interviewed your mother rather than simply asking her to leave. Angela joined the conversation carrying an updated incident report. Mrs. Azenther Collins told us she thought completing the paperwork in advance would save everyone time because she planned to help once Lauren was discharged. I frowned. Help? By taking over the discharge process? Angela nodded. According to her statement, she believed new mothers were often too exhausted to make good decisions, and that experienced grandmothers should handle practical matters. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That's exactly how she thinks. There was sadness in his voice now, rather than anger. She honestly believes good intentions excuse ignoring boundaries. Rebecca sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. Mr. Mitchell, I want to be clear about something. Daniel looked up. Your mother never came close to removing Emma from the hospital. The safeguards worked exactly as designed. But her repeated attempts to insert herself into official medical decisions created enough concern that we had to document every interaction. She handed us copies of the completed incident summary. The report was remarkably factual. It described timeline, policy references, electronic modifications, visitor credential changes, and corrective actions. There were no dramatic accusations or emotional language, just documented facts. Reading those pages reminded me how different institutions operate compared with families. Hospitals don't settle disagreements by deciding who cries the loudest. They follow procedures because procedures protect people when emotions become unreliable. That evening became the first peaceful hours Daniel and I had enjoyed since Emma's birth. The visitor restrictions remained exactly as we originally requested. My parents arrived briefly after calling ahead, spent 20 quiet minutes meeting their granddaughter, hugged us both, and left before Emma's next feeding. Nobody argued. Nobody demanded photographs. Nobody asked to hold the baby longer than we were comfortable with. Watching them respect our wishes made me realize how little we had actually been asking for all along. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're simply expectations that everyone follows the same rules. When people respect them naturally, nobody even notices they exist. The following morning, Rebecca returned with good news. The internal review had been completed much faster than expected because every relevant event had been captured electronically. We've already implemented several changes, she explained. From now on, administrative visitor overrides in maternity require direct confirmation from the recovering mother whenever medically possible. If the mother is temporarily unavailable, the request automatically waits until verification can occur. Angela smiled. Sometimes the best improvements come from mistakes that never become tragedies. I appreciated hearing that. Hospitals, like families, aren't perfect. The difference is that healthy organizations learn from errors instead of pretending they never happened. Daniel asked the question both of us had quietly avoided since yesterday. What happens to Mom? Rebecca answered honestly. Our responsibility isn't determining family consequences. Our responsibility is hospital policy. She explained that Patricia's visitor privileges had been permanently revoked for the remainder of our hospital stay. Future visits would require advance approval from both parents after discharge, if we chose to allow them. Additionally, the hospital placed an internal administrative notation on the incident so that similar situations could be identified more quickly if anyone ever attempted the same behavior again. This isn't about punishing your mother, Rebecca said gently. It's about protecting every family who comes here after yours. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to meet Patricia before we left the hospital. He asked whether I wanted to join him. I shook my head. No. He looked surprised. You're sure? I smiled tiredly. This conversation isn't about me anymore. It's between a son and his mother. Daniel kissed Emma's forehead, squeezed my hand gently, and walked downstairs to the hospital's family consultation room where Patricia had agreed to meet. I remained in the maternity room, feeding Emma while sunlight filtered softly through the window. For the first time since labor began, everything felt quiet. No interruptions, no arguments, just my daughter breathing peacefully against my shoulder. Daniel returned nearly an hour later looking emotionally exhausted. He sat beside the bed for several moments before speaking. "She apologized," he said quietly. "I waited, but," he sighed. "She apologized for how everything turned out." I nodded slowly. "Not for what she actually did. No." He looked toward Emma, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. "She still believes she was helping." That didn't surprise me. Some people spend so many years believing their intentions matter more than other people's boundaries that they genuinely struggle to recognize the difference. Daniel reached for my hand. I told her something I've probably needed to say for years. What was that? He looked directly at me. That becoming a grandmother doesn't make her a third parent. The room stayed quiet after that. And neither of us needed to say anything else. The message had finally been delivered. Whether Patricia accepted it would be her responsibility, not ours. I have. The following morning, discharge day finally arrived. A nurse carefully checked my identification bracelet. Then Daniel's Livox, then Emma's tiny matching bracelet. Since the Emma's way, every number matched perfectly. Angela smiled as she completed the final verification. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "Congratulations. Your daughter is officially going home. Adia?" As Daniel secured Emma into her car seat, another nurse walked into the room carrying a small envelope. "Jamie, this was left for you," she said. Dude, there wasn't a name. Aved. I opened it carefully. 12 us. Inside was a handwritten note. Mita, only one sentence. Amok. A mother should never have to prove she's the mother. So there was no signature. Yes, but somehow I already knew exactly who had written it. My F. The note remained on my bedside table for the rest of the morning. I turned it over several times, hoping there might be another message or a signature hidden somewhere on the back. There wasn't. Controlled. Just one simple sentence written in neat blue ink. A mother should never have to prove she's the mother. Daniel read it quietly before slipping it back into the envelope. "Do you think Rebecca wrote it?" he asked. I smiled. Maybe. Angela had defended me. Rebecca had protected our family. Even Melissa had apologized sincerely for her mistake. Any one of them could have written those words. In the end, it didn't really matter who held the pen. Sterile was knowing someone inside that hospital understood exactly what had happened. They hadn't seen me as an emotional patient causing problems. They had seen a mother whose rights deserved the same protection as her medical care. Our discharge process took less than 30 minutes because every document had already been reviewed the previous afternoon. Angela personally verified our identification bracelets one final time before gently removing mine. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mitchell," she said warmly. "You're officially discharged." She smiled down at Emma, sleeping peacefully inside her car seat. "And she's going home with exactly the people she was always supposed to go home with." Daniel thanked every nurse individually before we left the maternity floor. As the elevator doors closed, I looked back down the quiet hallway one last time. 24 hours earlier, it had been the place where I was told not to disturb my own child. Now, it simply looked like what it had always been meant to be: a hospital full of professionals helping families begin new chapters. The first weeks at home were everything new parenthood promises and everything it warns you about. We barely slept. Emma seemed to believe 2 o'clock in the morning was the perfect time for long conversations only babies understand. Laundry multiplied faster than either of us thought possible. Bottles appeared in every room. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was a quiet happiness that made every difficult night worthwhile. Daniel took 6 weeks of parental leave, and together we slowly learned the rhythm of caring for someone who depended on us for absolutely everything. During that time, we made one decision neither of us regretted. We didn't invite Patricia to visit. Not because we wanted revenge, because trust, once broken around something as important as our daughter, needed time to rebuild. My parents visited often, always calling ahead first. They never stayed longer than we asked. Sometimes my mother simply folded baby clothes while talking with me in the kitchen. My father quietly assembled nursery furniture without insisting there was a better way to do it. Watching them interact with Emma reminded me that grandparents can be deeply involved in a child's life without trying to become parents themselves. Respecting boundaries hadn't reduced their relationship with their granddaughter. It had strengthened it. Every visit ended with smiles instead of arguments, because nobody spent the afternoon competing for control. About 2 months later, Rebecca Lawson called unexpectedly. At first, I worried something had happened with the hospital records, but her voice sounded cheerful. "Nothing's wrong," she assured me. "Actually, I was hoping to ask a favor." She explained that the hospital's maternity department had completed a review of visitor authorization procedures after our incident. Several policy improvements had already been implemented, including mandatory bedside verification for recovering mothers whenever possible. "We're holding a staff education seminar next month," Rebecca said. "Would you be willing to share your experience from a patient's perspective?" I looked over at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her swing before answering. "If it helps another family avoid what happened to us, absolutely." The seminar took place in a small hospital auditorium filled with nurses, admissions staff, security officers, and maternity administrators. I wasn't there to criticize anyone. In fact, I began by thanking the employees who corrected the situation so quickly once they realized something was wrong. Then I told them something I wished every healthcare worker could hear. "After giving birth," I said, "most mothers aren't thinking like investigators. We're exhausted. We assume the people wearing badges know exactly what's happening. That's why your procedures matter so much. When you verify instead of assuming, you're protecting families who may not even realize they need protection." The room remained completely silent until I finished. Then the applause wasn't loud. It was respectful. Rebecca later told me the seminar would become part of orientation for every new maternity employee. That same week, Daniel received another call. This time it was from Patricia. She asked if she could meet us at a quiet coffee shop without bringing other relatives. We talked about it for several days before deciding to go. Not because we felt obligated, but because healthy boundaries also leave room for genuine change if someone is willing to make it. Patricia arrived early and looked noticeably different from the confident woman who had stood outside my hospital room months earlier. She seemed smaller somehow, quieter. After ordering coffee, She placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a handwritten letter. Not excuses. Not explanations. An apology. She admitted she had allowed her excitement about becoming a grandmother to convince herself she knew better than everyone else. She acknowledged writing the false note, changing the visitor arrangements, and trying to take control of decisions that were never hers to make. One sentence stood out more than all the others. I confused being important to Emma with being responsible for Emma. Daniel read the letter slowly before looking at his mother. Pre-met her. What changed? Patricia answered honestly. Had him do it. The hospital didn't embarrass me. The mainly? She paused. A fiber. It showed me how frightened Lauren must have been. For the first time since Emma was born, I believed she finally understood. Not perfectly, not completely, but out. But enough to recognize the difference between love and control. So, we didn't immediately return to how things had been before. That would have been unrealistic. Instead, we started with something much smaller. A 1-hour visit. The following Sunday, at our house, Alice, on our schedule, Hadafa, with one simple expectation. No. Respect the parents. Zoomzen. Patricia agreed without hesitation. When she arrived that afternoon, she didn't walk toward Emma first. She walked toward me. May I hold her? 3 words. Tone? 1 question. I would say 1 permission. Sophilium. It was the first time she'd ever asked. Ami. I smiled. May not. Yes. I am. And somehow, that tiny question accomplished what months of arguments never could. It reminded everyone in the room exactly who the parents were. Nearly a year passed before I fully realized how much that single day at the hospital had changed our family. Emma was walking now, filling every room in our house with tiny footsteps, endless curiosity, and the kind of laughter that makes even exhausting days feel worthwhile. Parenthood hadn't become easier. It had simply become familiar. Daniel and I had settled into our own routines, made our own traditions, and discovered that confidence as parents grows quietly through thousands of ordinary moments rather than one dramatic event. Patricia's relationship with us also changed, though not overnight. She never again arrived without calling first. She never referred to Emma as my baby after we gently explained why those words mattered. Most importantly, she stopped making decisions she hadn't been asked to make. At first, the changes felt almost unnatural, as though she were constantly reminding herself to pause before speaking. But over time, those pauses became habits. Instead of assuming, she asked. Instead of directing, she offered. It wasn't perfection. It was progress. And sometimes progress is the most honest apology a person can give. One afternoon, just before Emma's first birthday, Patricia invited me to lunch without Daniel. A year earlier, I probably would have declined. This time, I accepted. We met at a quiet cafe not far from the hospital where everything had happened. After we ordered, she reached into her purse and carefully placed something on the table. It was her old hospital visitor badge. The one identifying her as primary family contact. No, the badge had been hole-punched through the middle, so it could never be worn again. I kept it, she said quietly. I looked at her. So, why? She smiled sadly. Yomat, to remind myself how easy it is to convince yourself you're helping when you're really taking control. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she slid the badge across the table. I don't want it anymore. I looked down at it before gently pushing it back. Del, no. Do. She frowned. No. You should keep it. I am. Why? Because the reminder belongs to the person who learned the lesson. For the first time since I'd known her, she laughed. Not defensively. Not awkwardly. Just honestly. When Emma's first birthday finally arrived, Daniel and I kept the celebration intentionally small. Grandparents, a few close friends, cupcakes, balloons, and a backyard full of children chasing bubbles across the grass. There were no speeches, no dramatic announcements, no arguments over who held Emma first or opened presents. Patricia spent most of the afternoon sitting on the patio floor building block towers, only to laugh every time Emma knocked them over. My mother quietly helped refill drinks in the kitchen. My father grilled hamburgers while Daniel's father entertained the children with terrible magic tricks that somehow became the biggest attraction of the day. At one point, Aunt Rebecca, Daniel's aunt, not the hospital administrator, looked around the backyard and smiled. This feels different. My father nodded. Zay, it is. What changed? He looked toward Daniel and me chasing Emma across the lawn. We finally stopped confusing love with control. That sentence stayed with me long after everyone went home. Because it explained far more than our hospital experience. It explained years of family dynamics. People often believe loving someone gives them the right to direct that person's life. In reality, love becomes stronger when control disappears. Several months later, Rebecca Lawson invited Daniel and me back to the hospital for another maternity staff orientation. This time, we weren't there because something had gone wrong. We were there because the visitor verification policy, created after Emma's birth, had now been adopted across every maternity floor in the hospital system. During the presentation, Rebecca shared one statistic that surprised everyone. Unauthorized visitor incidents had dropped dramatically. Not because families had suddenly become less complicated. Emotionally, because employees now verified first instead of assuming. This what happens. Afterward, she quietly thanked us. You probably don't realize it, she said. But your story changed procedures for thousands of future families. I looked down at Emma, now asleep in her stroller after charming half the nursing staff. And if that's true, I smiled. Then something good came from a very difficult day. Rebecca nodded. So, usually that's how meaningful change happens. Driving home that afternoon, Daniel reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up outside that hospital room? I looked out the window for a moment before answering. I know. Sometimes. And I think boundaries are a lot like seatbelts. He smiled. Memda, what do you mean? You hope you never need them. But you're always grateful they're there. He laughed softly. I married a philosopher. No. I smiled back. Dare, you married a mother. Oh. That night, after Emma finally fell asleep, I opened the keepsake box where we stored memories from her first year. Her hospital bracelet, Duff, her tiny knit cap. The first family photograph. Then, the anonymous note that still read, a mother should never have to prove she's the mother. A mother. I placed one more item inside, a copy of the hospital's updated visitor policy Rebecca had mailed us several weeks earlier. Not because I wanted to remember the conflict, but because I wanted Emma to grow up understanding something important. Rules don't exist because people expect the worst. They exist because love deserves protection when emotions become complicated. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether I ever forgave Patricia Fuda. The answer isn't as simple as yes or no. Forgiveness isn't pretending nothing happened. Forgiveness is allowing someone the opportunity to become different while refusing to erase the lessons that kept your family safe. She earned another chance. It's a point, not because she was entitled to one. Today, because she chose to respect the boundaries she'd once ignored. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, I hope you remember one thing. The day I became a mother wasn't defined by the person who tried to stand between me and my daughter. It was defined by the people who quietly stood beside me instead. The nurse who verified instead of assuming. The administrator who followed policy instead of pressure. The husband who chose his family instead of avoiding conflict. And finally, the mother who learned that asking permission is one of the deepest forms of respect. Because becoming a grandparent is a privilege. Becoming a parent is a responsibility. And no matter how much someone loves your child, those two things will never be the same. Quote unquote, end of story.